The first time King Cale Stormborn saw her, he thought she was utterly mad. The reports had been consistent over the past month. Whispers from the border patrols about a strange woman who lived alone in a dilapidated cottage at the edge of Silvercrest territory, a woman who spent her days wandering the forest talking to herself. Some said she conversed with trees. Others claimed she sang to the wind. The most recent report, delivered by his head scout Marcus with barely concealed amusement, described her having an animated discussion with a cluster of butterflies in the meadow near Whispering Creek. Cale had initially dismissed it as harmless eccentricity, the kind of oddity that occasionally appeared in the vast territories under his rule. But then the dreams started. Every night for the past week, Cale had been waking in cold sweats, his heart racing with the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. In his dreams, he walked through mist-filled forests where voices called his name, where shadows moved with purpose, and where he always ended up at the same place, a moonlit clearing filled with monarch butterflies that seemed to glow from within. Each time he reached for them, each time he tried to understand what they wanted, he would wake, gasping, his mate bond aching with a phantom pain he hadn't felt in 3 years, not since Lyanna died. The coincidence was too pointed to ignore, and Cale had learned long ago that in a world where werewolves existed, coincidences were often messages waiting to be decoded. So on a crisp autumn evening, he decided to investigate personally, much to the concern of his beta Jackson, who argued that a king had better things to do than chase stories about mad women and butterflies. The cottage appeared abandoned at first glance, its thatched roof patched with moss, its wooden walls weathered gray by time and elements. But the garden surrounding it told a different story entirely. Herbs grew in careful spirals. Night-blooming flowers clustered near the door, and wind chimes made from bones and crystals hung from the eaves, singing softly in the breeze. Cale's wolf stirred uneasily within him, sensing something his human mind couldn't quite grasp, a thrumming energy that made his skin prickle with awareness. He found her exactly where Marcus had described, in the meadow beyond the cottage where Whispering Creek babbled over smooth stones. She sat cross-legged in the grass, her wild auburn hair catching the last rays of sunset, and she was indeed talking to butterflies. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think is really going on with Alara's gift. I love reading your theories, and they help me create more content like this for you all. Dozens of them, monarchs and swallowtails and painted ladies, swirled around her in patterns too deliberate to be random. They landed on her outstretched hands, her shoulders, even her hair, and she spoke to them in a gentle voice that carried clearly in the quiet evening air. "I know you're worried," she was saying, her tone as serious as if she were addressing the royal council. "But he's not ready yet. The veil is still too strong, and he carries too much guilt. You have to be patient." Cale froze at the tree line, watching as the butterflies seemed to respond to her words, their formation shifting and reforming like a living kaleidoscope. "Yes, I know time is running short," she continued, and now there was urgency in her voice. "The darkness is growing stronger, but if we push too hard, we'll lose him entirely, and then everything our families died for will have been for nothing." The words hit Cale like a physical blow. Our families died for. He stepped forward without thinking, a twig snapping under his boot, and the woman's head whipped around with supernatural speed. Her eyes, when they met his, were the color of aged whiskey shot through with flecks of gold, and they held a depth of knowing that made him feel exposed, seen in a way he hadn't experienced since Lyanna's death. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the butterflies continued their dance between them like a bridge made of wings and autumn colors. Then she smiled, sad and knowing and somehow terrifying in its certainty, and she said in a voice that resonated with power, "Hello, Kyle. She's been waiting for you to find me. We all have." Kyle's wolf surged forward, protective and aggressive in equal measure, and he felt his eyes flash gold as his alpha authority flooded the clearing. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to the dangerous growl that made even his strongest warriors step back. "How do you know that name? How do you know anything about my mate?" But the woman didn't flinch, didn't show even a flicker of the fear that should have been instinctive in the presence of an alpha king who was barely maintaining control. Instead, she stood gracefully, and the butterflies lifted with her, forming a crown of beating wings above her head that caught the dying light like stained glass. "My name is Alara Nightwhisper," she said quietly. And even that simple introduction sent shivers down his spine, because he knew that name. Knew it from old stories his grandmother had told him about the ancient bloodlines, the ones that had died out generations ago. "And I know about Liana because she's standing right beside you, Cale. She has been for the past 3 years, trying desperately to warn you about what's coming, but you've been too wrapped up in guilt and grief to hear her." Alara tilted her head, her gaze shifting to focus on empty air just to his left, and her expression softened with compassion. "She says you need to stop blaming yourself for the accident. She says the brakes were cut, that it wasn't your fault, and that she's forgiven you for the argument you had that morning, the one you've replayed in your mind every single day since." The world tilted sideways. Kyle staggered, his breath coming in short gasps, because nobody knew about that argument. Nobody knew about the stupid, pointless fight they'd had about wedding arrangements and political alliances. The last words he'd spoken to her before she'd driven off in anger and never come home. Nobody knew that he'd been too proud to call her, too stubborn to apologize, and that she'd died thinking he was angry with her. "You're lying," he rasped. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was too much certainty in her eyes, too much detail in her words. This is some kind of trick, some manipulation. Alara's expression grew fierce, protective in a way that reminded him of Liana herself. "She says you gave her a silver bracelet on your first anniversary, one you had specially made with both your pack symbols intertwined. She wore it every day, even though the clasp was broken and it kept falling off. She says you used to tease her about fixing it, and she would laugh and tell you that some things were perfect in their imperfection." Cale's knees nearly buckled. The bracelet. God. The bracelet that had been found at the accident site, somehow thrown clear when everything else had been destroyed. He'd kept it in a box by his bed, unable to look at it, but unable to throw it away. "She says," Alara continued, her voice gentling, "that she needs you to listen now. Really listen. Because the same people who killed her are planning something much worse, and you're the only one who can stop them. If this story is giving you chills, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because things are about to get even more intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next." Cale found himself sitting on the ground without remembering how he got there, his hands shaking as 3 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled around him. "I don't understand," he whispered, and he hated how broken he sounded. How much like the devastated mate he'd been, in the immediate aftermath, rather than the strong king he'd forced himself to become. "What are you? How is this possible?" Alara sat down across from him, close enough that he could see the swirl of colors in her eyes, the way they seemed to shift and change like looking into deep water. The butterflies settled around them in a protective circle, and in the gathering darkness, they began to glow with a soft bioluminescence that definitely wasn't natural. "I'm what's called a spirit listener," Alara explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting ancient history. "It's an old bloodline gift, one that most people think died out centuries ago. We can hear the voices of those who've passed beyond the veil, communicate with the spirits that linger between worlds, and sometimes, if we're strong enough, we can see them too." She gestured to the space beside him, and Kyle found himself turning to look, even though he knew he'd see nothing but empty air. "Liana has been trying to reach you through dreams, through signs, through anything she could manage, but the veil is strong, and you've been blocking her out with guilt, so she found me instead." "Why you?" Kyle asked, and he heard the accusation in his own voice, the irrational anger of a grieving mate who wanted to blame someone, anyone, for the fact that he couldn't hear his own beloved. But Alara didn't take offense. She simply looked at him with those ancient eyes and said, "Because my parents were killed by the same people who killed Liana, and because their spirits led her to me. Because this is bigger than just one death or one pack, Cale. There's a conspiracy that's been growing in the shadows for decades, and it's about to come to fruition in a way that will destroy everything the old bloodlines built." Over the next hour, as true darkness fell, and the meadow filled with spirits that Cale couldn't see, but could somehow feel pressing against his awareness. Alara told him everything. She explained how she'd been born into the Night Whisper line, one of the last families to carry the Spirit Listener gift, and how her parents had been researching something dangerous in the months before their deaths. Something about forbidden magic and old pacts that should have stayed buried. She described how they'd been killed in what was ruled an accidental fire when she was 16, how the pack had turned on her when she started claiming she could still hear them, still receive their warnings. She'd been cast out, labeled insane, forced to survive on the fringes of pack territory, where nobody wanted to acknowledge her existence. But the spirits never stopped talking, she said, and there was steel beneath the softness in her voice. My parents kept investigating even after death, kept gathering information, and 3 years ago they made contact with Liana's spirit right after she crossed over. That's when we started to understand the pattern, the way certain wolves with specific bloodline, gifts were being systematically eliminated, made to look like accidents or natural causes. Your mate wasn't killed because of anything she did, Kale. She was killed because of what she was, because she carried the healer's touch in her bloodline, and someone is collecting us, eliminating anyone who might be able to stop what they're planning. Kale felt his alpha rage building, felt his wolf demanding blood and vengeance, but he forced himself to stay focused. Who? He growled, and the word came out with enough power that the trees around them shuddered. Who is doing this? Give me names and I'll tear them apart myself. But Alara shook her head, her expression grim. It's not that simple. The people behind this are well hidden, protected by layers of manipulation and misdirection. But Liana and my parents have been gathering clues, and they think the conspiracy reaches into your own council. Someone close to you, someone you trust, has been feeding information to the enemy. Lori, betrayal cut deep, but Kale had been an alpha long enough to know that power always attracted corruption. Tell me everything you know, he commanded. And this time it wasn't a request, but a direct order backed by alpha authority. Alara's eyes flashed in response, and for the first time, he felt the pushback of real power. Not werewolf dominance, but something older. Something that made his wolf sit up and take notice. I don't answer to your authority, King Kale, she said quietly, but there was no disrespect in it, only statement of fact. I answer to the spirits, and to the old laws that predate pack hierarchies. But I'll help you because our goals align, because Liana asks me to, and because I'm tired of hiding while good people die. Don't forget to leave a comment telling me what you think about Alara's powers, and who you suspect might be the traitor on the council. Your engagement really helps this channel grow. They talked until the moon rose high overhead, Alara relaying. Messages from Liana that made Kale laugh and cry in equal measure. Small intimate details that proved beyond doubt that his mate's spirit was really there, really trying to help him. She told him about the silver scar on his ribs from a training accident when he was 12, about the way he hummed off key in the shower, about the secret fear he'd confessed to her one night, that he wasn't good enough to be king, that he would fail his people. And through it all, Alara watched him with a mixture of compassion and sadness, as if she understood exactly how much it hurt to be so close to someone you loved, and yet unable to truly reach them. Why can't I hear her myself? Kale finally asked, and the question came out raw with longing. If she's really here, why do I need you as an intermediary? Alara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. Because you're blocking yourself with guilt, Kale. The mate bond doesn't just disappear when one partner dies. It transforms, becomes a bridge between worlds, but only if both sides are open to it. You've been punishing yourself so thoroughly that you've walled off that part of your soul. Liana can feel your grief like a physical barrier between you. Then help me, Kale said, and he didn't care that he was begging, didn't care that he was showing weakness to a woman he'd just met. Teach me to hear her. I need to tell her I'm sorry. I need her to know that I never stopped loving her. Alara reached out and took his own hand, her skin warm and alive in a way that made him acutely aware of how cold he'd been feeling for years. I can try, she promised. But it won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Opening yourself to the spirit world when you've been closed off for so long requires breaking down walls you've built for protection. It's going to hurt, Kale, It's going to force you to feel everything you've been avoiding. I don't care," he said fiercely. "I'll do whatever it takes." And so began the strangest and most painful education of Cale's life. Every evening for the next 2 weeks, he would return to Alara's cottage, and she would guide him through meditations and exercises designed to open his spiritual awareness. She taught him to quiet his mind, to stop the constant churn of guilt and responsibility and just be present in the moment. She showed him how to recognize the subtle signs of spiritual presence, the way the air would shift, the way his mate bond would warm even though Liana was gone from the physical world. The process was excruciating. Every session brought up memories he'd buried, forced him to confront the depth of his loss all over again. He would leave Alara's cottage emotionally shattered, barely able to maintain his composure until he was alone in his chambers, where he could finally break down. But he kept coming back, because gradually, incrementally, he started to feel something changing. The dreams became clearer, less chaotic. He began to sense a presence, hovering at the edge of his awareness, warm and familiar and achingly beloved. And through it all, he found himself increasingly aware of Alara herself. She was nothing like Liana, nothing like any woman he'd ever known. Where Liana had been warm sunshine and easy laughter, Alara was moonlight and mysteries, comfortable with darkness in a way that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. She moved through the world with quiet confidence, utterly unbothered by the isolation that had been forced upon her, finding companionship in spirits and nature that most people couldn't perceive. She was brilliant and strange and occasionally terrifying, especially when her eyes would go distant and she would relay messages from spirits who had been dead for centuries, speaking with the authority of someone who walked between worlds as easily as others walked between rooms. His pack noticed the changes in him, of course. Jackson cornered him after a council meeting, concern written all over his beta's face. "You've been disappearing every evening for 2 weeks," Jackson said bluntly. "And you come back looking like you've been through a war. What's going on, Cale? Is this about that woman the scouts reported?" Cale had debated how much to tell his inner circle, how much they would even believe. But he'd learned long ago that leadership required trust, so he told Jackson everything, watching his beta's expression cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally grim acceptance. "A spirit. Listener," Jackson said slowly, testing the words. "Like in the old stories. And you believe her? You believe Liana is really communicating through this Alara?" Cale met his friend's eyes steadily. "She knows things nobody else could know, Jackson. Private things, intimate details that died with Liana. And more than that, I can feel it. My mate bond is responding to something, warming in ways it hasn't since she died. Either Alara is the most elaborate con artist in history, or she's exactly what she claims to be." Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "If you trust her, then I trust her. But Cale, if there really is a conspiracy, if someone on the council is involved, we need to be careful. We can't let anyone know what you're investigating." Cale nodded grimly. "I know. That's why I need you to start doing some quiet research. Look into the deaths Alara mentioned, the ones that were ruled accidents. See if you can find any patterns, any connections we might have." "Missed." His beta's expression hardened with determination. "Consider it done. And Cale, if someone really did kill Liana, if this wasn't just a tragic accident, I want to be there when you make them pay. If you're loving this supernatural mystery, smash that subscribe button, because we're just getting started with the revelations. And trust me, you won't believe where this story goes." 3 weeks after their first meeting, Cale finally broke through. He was sitting across from Alara in her cottage, the space between them filled with candles and herbs that she said helped thin the veil, when suddenly the world shifted. It wasn't a visual change exactly, more like a sixth sense clicking into place. And suddenly he could see her, Liana. She was translucent and glowing softly, but it was unmistakably her, standing in the corner of the cottage with tears streaming down her incorporeal face. "Cale," she breathed, and her voice sounded like wind chimes and distant bells. "Oh, my love, you can finally hear me." Kyle surged to his feet, instinct driving him toward her even though his rational mind knew he couldn't touch her. couldn't hold her the way he desperately wanted to. "Liana," he choked out, and years of grief came pouring out in that single word. "I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry for that fight, for not calling you, for letting you die thinking I was angry. I would give anything to take it back, anything to have you here again." But Liana was shaking her head, her ghostly form moving with the grace he remembered so well. "No, my heart, no. You have to stop carrying this guilt. What happened wasn't your fault. The brakes on my car were cut, Kyle. Someone murdered me, and they did it because they knew it would break you, would make you too consumed with grief to notice what they were planning." The revelation should have shocked him. But after weeks of preparation with Alara, he'd already suspected as much. What broke him was seeing the certainty in Liana's eyes, the lack of blame, the pure love that radiated from her even in death. "I miss you," he whispered. "Every day, every moment. I don't know how to do this without you." Liana floated closer, and even though he couldn't feel her touch, he sensed the intention of it, the ghostly caress against his cheek. "You're not without me," she said softly. "I'm always here, always watching over you. But Kale, you have to let me go. Not forget me, never that. But release the guilt and the grief poisoning you, because you have work to do, and you can't do it while you're still chained to the past." "What work?" he asked. Though he already suspected the answer, Liana's form flickered, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "The one who killed me is planning to tear down the veil between the living and the dead, to raise an army of spirits bound to his will. He wants to overthrow the natural order, to make himself immortal by enslaving those who've passed beyond. If he succeeds, he won't just destroy the werewolf world, Kale. He'll unravel the fabric of life and death itself." She turned to look at Alara, who had been sitting silently through this reunion, her expression carefully neutral. "That's why I led you to Alara. She's the only spirit listener strong enough to help you stop this. And she's the only person in the world who understands what you're facing." Kyle looked at Alara too, really looked at her, and saw the strength beneath her quiet exterior, the determination in the set of her jaw. "Will you help me?" he asked. And the question was far bigger than just investigating a conspiracy. He was asking if she would stand with him against forces that terrified even the dead, if she would risk everything to stop a threat most people couldn't even perceive. Alara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," she said quietly. "Every spirit I've ever spoken to, every message I've received, it's all been leading to this moment. So yes, Kale Stormborn, I'll help you save the world." Over the following weeks, they worked together to unravel the conspiracy that had been growing in the shadows. Alara would enter deep meditative trances, communicating with spirits who had witnessed conversations and events that the living had thought were secret. Liana and Alara's parents acted as their primary investigators on the other side of the veil, gathering information and identifying the key players in the plot. What they discovered was far worse than Kale had imagined. The conspiracy wasn't just about power or territory. It was about a forbidden ritual that required the blood of specific bloodlines. Families who carried ancient gifts like spirit listening, healing touch, prophetic dreams, and elemental control. The orchestrator had been systematically eliminating these bloodlines for decades, harvesting their essence at the moment of death to fuel a spell that would give him dominion over the spirit world. The identity of the mastermind, when they finally uncovered it, was a betrayal that cut Kale to his core. Councilman Aldrich Grayson, his father's most trusted advisor, the man who had helped Kale navigate the early days of his kingship after his parents' deaths, the mentor he'd relied on for wisdom and guidance. Aldrich was a necromancer, a practitioner of the darkest magic, and he'd been hiding in plain sight for over 40 years. He'd orchestrated the deaths of Kale's parents when they'd gotten too close to discovering his true nature. He'd killed Liana when her healing touch had accidentally revealed the corruption in his aura during a council meeting, and he'd targeted Alara's parents when their research had started connecting the pattern of bloodline deaths. "We need proof," Jackson insisted, when Kale told his inner circle what they'd discovered. "We can't just accuse a sitting councilman of mass murder and dark magic based on conversations with spirits. The pack will think you've lost your mind." But Alara had thought of that. The ritual requires physical components, she explained, spreading out ancient texts she'd inherited from her parents. Aldrich would need to keep trophies from each kill, items that contain the essence of his victims. If we can find his workshop, find the evidence, we'll have everything we need. Breaking into Aldrich's estate was one of the most dangerous things Cale had ever, done. Not because of physical security, but because of the magical wards that protected it. Alara had to work for hours to dismantle them, calling on friendly spirits to confuse the detection spells while she carefully unraveled Aldrich's protections. What they found in the hidden basement beneath his study was the stuff of nightmares. Dozens of bottles lined the shelves, each one containing what Alara identified as captured soul fragments. Personal items from the victims were arranged on an altar, including Liana's broken bracelet and a photograph of Alara's parents. And in the center of it all was a massive grimoire, its pages filled with instructions for the ritual that would tear the veil between worlds. They barely escaped before Aldrich returned home, but they had what they needed. The evidence was irrefutable, documented in Aldrich's own hand, with dates and methods and triumphant notes about each successful harvest. Cale called an emergency council meeting, and with Alara, standing beside him and Jackson flanking his other side, he laid out the entire conspiracy for the assembled pack leaders. He showed them the grimoire, the soul bottles, the detailed records of murder, and when Aldrich tried to deny it, tried to claim the evidence was fabricated, Alara did something that made even Cale's blood run cold. She called the spirits of the dead forward, and for one terrible, beautiful moment, she made them visible to everyone in the room. Liana appeared beside Cale, her hand resting on his shoulder. Alara's parents manifested behind their daughter, their pride in her evident even in death. And dozens of other victims filled the chamber, all of them pointing accusatory fingers at Aldrich, all of them demanding justice for lives cut short. The councilman's face went white as corpse flesh, and his carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "You don't understand," he snarled, dark magic crackling around his hands as he prepared to fight. "The old ways are dying. The bloodline gifts are fading. I was trying to preserve them, to create something eternal and powerful that would survive when the last of you gifted ones died out. You were murdering innocent people." Cale roared, his alpha power flooding the room with such intensity that wolves throughout the territory would later report feeling the urge to submit even from miles away. "You killed my mate. You killed my parents. You destroyed families and called it preservation. The battle that followed was brief, but brutal." Aldrich was powerful, his necromantic magic fueled by decades of stolen essence, but he was one man against an entire pack of furious werewolves, led by a king who had found his purpose again. When it was over, when Aldrich lay defeated and bound in silver chains that would prevent any further magic use, Cale stood over him with eyes that glowed pure gold. "You're going to spend the rest of your very long life in the deepest cell we have," Cale pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And every single day you're going to feel the weight of what you've done. Because Alara is going to make sure the spirits of your victims can visit you, can remind you of every life you stole." He turned to his spirit listener, and the look they shared was one of perfect understanding. Two people who had found in each other the strength to face impossible darkness. "Can you do that?" he asked quietly. Alara's smile was sharp as a blade. "It would be my absolute pleasure. I hope you're enjoying this intense journey. If you are, please like this video and share it with friends who love supernatural romance with real stakes and consequences." The aftermath of Aldrich's exposure and imprisonment was complicated. The pack had to grapple with the revelation that dark magic existed, that spirits were real, and that their king had been communicating with his dead mate for weeks. Some were skeptical, others frightened, but most were simply relieved that the threat had been neutralized. Alara worked tirelessly to help the spirits of Aldrich's victims find peace, conducting ceremonies that allowed them to say goodbye to their living loved ones and cross over properly. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, but she approached it with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. Cale found himself spending more and more time with her, even after the immediate crisis had passed. What had started as necessity had become genuine friendship, and if he was honest with himself, something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. She challenged him in ways no one else did, called him on his bullshit when he slipped back into guilt patterns, made him laugh with her dry observations about pack politics and her utterly bizarre conversations with long-dead wolves who had opinions about everything. She was brilliant and infuriating and completely unimpressed by his title, treating him like a person rather than a king, and he'd forgotten how refreshing that could be. One evening, about 2 months after Aldrich's defeat, Kyle returned to Alara's cottage to find it transformed. She'd cleaned and repaired the structure, added new gardens, and most surprisingly, there were other people there. 3 young wolves, teenagers by the look of them, were sitting in her garden while she taught them meditation techniques. Spirit listeners, she explained, when Kale raised a questioning eyebrow. Or potentially anyway. They've all been hearing voices, seeing things others can't, and their packs were starting to turn on them the way mine did to me. I'm teaching them to control and understand their gifts instead of fearing them. Kyle felt something warm bloom in his chest as he watched her work, patient and encouraging with these frightened young people who had found in her the mentor they desperately needed. You're building something, he observed. A new tradition, a way to preserve the old bloodline gifts. Alara looked up at him, and there was hope in her eyes that he'd never seen before. I'm trying. I thought if I could gather the surviving gifted ones, teach them to use their abilities, maybe we could prevent what Aldrich feared, not through murder and dark magic, but through community and knowledge. You'll need resources, Kale said immediately, his mind already working through logistics. A proper building, funding, protection. Let me help. Let Silvercrest become a sanctuary for the gifted. Bloodlines. Alara's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked uncharacteristically vulnerable. You would do that? Even though it would mark your pack as different, as the ones who harbor the strange and the supernatural. Kale stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her whiskey-colored eyes, close enough to catch her scent of herbs and night-blooming flowers. Alara, you saved my pack, helped me bring a murderer to justice, and gave me the chance to find peace with Leanna's death. I would give you anything you asked for. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Then Leanna's voice, soft and amused, spoke from the space beside them that only Alara could see. She's right here, you know. Watching you two dance around your feelings has become the most entertaining thing about being dead. Alara blushed, the color rising in her cheeks in a way Kale found completely endearing, and he couldn't help but laugh even as his own face heated. Leanna says we're being ridiculous, Alara reported, and there was shy humor in her voice. She says I should tell you that I've developed feelings for you, and you should tell me that you feel the same way, and we should stop wasting time pretending otherwise. Kyle felt his heart stutter, because he hadn't been sure, hadn't wanted to assume, hadn't known if what he felt was real, or just gratitude and proximity. But hearing it stated so baldly by his deceased mate, knowing that Leanna not only approved, but was actively encouraging this, gave him a courage he hadn't possessed before. Is that true? He asked Alara directly, holding her gaze. Have you developed feelings for me? She bit her lip, a gesture of nervousness that was so at odds with her usual confidence that it made him want to pull her close and promise her she never had to be afraid with him. Yes, she admitted quietly. I know it's complicated, and I know you loved Leanna, and I would never want to replace her or diminish what you had. But yes, Kale, I have feelings for you. Leanna says she loves you too, Alara continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. She says that love doesn't end with death, and her loving you doesn't mean you can't love someone else. She says she wants you to be happy, to find joy again, and that she thinks we're perfect for each other, because I understand both the weight you carry and the magic that surrounds our world. Kale reached out, slowly, giving Alara every chance to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. I do have feelings for you, he confessed. You're nothing like Leanna, and I think that's what makes this possible. You're not a replacement or a substitute. You're entirely yourself, and I've fallen for the brilliant, strange, powerful woman who talks to butterflies and walks between worlds like it's the most natural thing in existence. When he kissed her, It felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before, familiar and new all at once. Ilara kissed him back with an enthusiasm that made him smile against her lips. And somewhere in the background, he could have sworn he heard Liana's delighted laughter, a sound of pure joy that she'd managed to bring these two wounded souls together. They pulled apart eventually, both breathless and smiling, and Ilara whispered, "She's happy. She says this is exactly what she hoped would happen, and she's going to cross over now because she knows you're going to be okay." Cale turned to where he'd learned Liana's spirit usually manifested, and even though he still couldn't see her clearly, he could feel her presence stronger than ever before. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go, for finding Ilara, for fighting from beyond death to save our pack. I will always love you, Liana. Always." The temperature in the room shifted, grew warmer, and he felt what could only be described as a ghostly kiss against his forehead, a final blessing from the mate who had defined so much of his life. Then the presence faded, and Kyle knew with absolute certainty that Liana had moved on, had found her peace, leaving him free to build something new. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the epilogue is going to show you what happens when a king and a spirit listener build a life together. And trust me, it's magical. The years that followed were transformative for Silvercrest, and for Cale personally. Ilara's school for the gifted bloodlines grew from 3 students to over 30, drawing young wolves from across the continent who possessed abilities their own packs didn't understand. She taught them control, helped them embrace rather than fear their gifts, and in doing so, created a new generation of wolves who could bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. The old ways weren't dying after all. They were evolving, adapting, becoming, stronger through acceptance rather than secrecy. Cale and Ilara's relationship deepened gradually, built on friendship and mutual respect before it ever became romance. She never tried to be Liana, never attempted to fill that specific hole in his heart, but instead carved out her own space beside it. A different kind of love that was no less profound for being different. They would take walks through the forest where she taught him to sense the spirits that lingered in ancient places, to communicate with the land itself in ways that made him a better king, because he understood the true depth of what he was protecting. On their wedding day, 3 years after they'd first met, the ceremony was attended by both the living and the dead. Ilara had thinned the veil enough that spirits could manifest for those with eyes to see, and Cale's parents stood proudly in the front row alongside Ilara's, all of them beaming with approval. And there, serving as Ilara's spiritual maid of honor, was Liana, radiant and joyful. Proof that love transcended death, and that endings could be beginnings in disguise. When the ceremony was complete, and Cale kissed his new wife, the spirits erupted in celebration, their joy creating a shower of light that even the non-gifted could perceive. A blessing from the other side, for a union that bridged both worlds. Their children, when they came, carried gifts from both bloodlines. The oldest could heal with a touch, and hear the whispers of spirits. The middle child could manipulate the elements and predict the future in dreams. The youngest, much to everyone's amusement, could talk to animals and plants with the same ease Ilara spoke to butterflies. Silvercrest became known as the Pack, where the impossible was commonplace, where the gifted were celebrated rather than feared, where the veil between worlds was honored as sacred rather than something to avoid. Kyle never forgot Liana, never stopped honoring her memory, but he also never let grief define him again. He'd learned that love was infinite, that opening his heart to Ilara didn't diminish what he'd felt for his first mate, but rather proved that the heart could expand to hold multiple truths. He'd learned that endings and beginnings often wore the same face, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in the strangest packages, like a mad woman talking to butterflies in a moonlit meadow, who turned out to be exactly what he needed to find himself again. On quiet evenings, Cale would sometimes find Ilara in their garden, surrounded by monarchs and swallowtails, having animated conversations that he now understood weren't madness, but connection to something most people had forgotten existed. He would watch her with a smile, marveling at the strange path that had brought them together. grateful for a dead woman's love and a living woman's courage, thankful for second chances, and for the reminder that magic was real if you only knew how to listen. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the veil between worlds grew thin, he would feel Leanna's presence nearby, a warm brush against his awareness that felt like approval and blessing. She would never truly be gone. Not as long as he and Alara kept her memory alive. Not as long as love persisted beyond death's door. It was a strange comfort, knowing that the woman he'd lost was happy for the life he'd built. That in some cosmic way, she'd orchestrated her own replacement by finding him someone who could understand both his grief and his hope. The Alpha King who had once been broken by loss had been remade by love. Multiple loves in multiple forms. And in learning to talk to butterflies and spirits, and the space between heartbeats, he'd found not just healing, but transcendence. The end of one story had become the beginning of another, and Kyle had learned to embrace them both, to hold yesterday and tomorrow in the same grateful hands, to understand that some bonds were eternal precisely because they knew when to transform, rather than trying to remain unchanged. If this story touched your heart, please share it, like it, and let me know in the comments what you loved most about Kale and Alara's journey. Your support means everything, and helps me create more magical stories like this one for you. Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas. Agente Roteiro, Alpha King, ING. Sonnet. 4.5 Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.